Military cemeteries dot the landscape between Chunk Bahia and Cape Helis. Turkish, Australian, British, French. The legends of the Gallipoli campaign have been woven into the founding narratives of Turkey and Australia. But today, what actually happened here can be fully told. The first glimmer of dawn over the Dardanelles. The Kilit Bahia fortress controls the narrowest place in this sea lane between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. On the other side of the straits is Asia and the city of Chanakli. The marine traffic that passes through is the vital lifeline of trade with the whole of southeastern Europe and Russia. Turkey has controlled the straits for 500 years. Here in 1915, the vestiges of the Oriental Empire defeated the most powerful forces of the West.
This is a victory almost, east, defeating the West, defeating the biggest and best navy in the world, the Royal Navy, defeating the best army in the world, the British Army.
The idea was to finish this in 3 days. They underestimated Turkish troops, and they thought civilized European soldier could defeat uneducated Turkish soldiers very easily here. But actually 99% of Turkish soldiers were from Anatolia, peasants. So peasants' armies are very difficult to defeat.
In the century after the Gallipoli campaign, much was written about the military and political failures that led to one of Britain's most disastrous military campaigns. But little has been said about the role the battles played in building Turkish national pride. The British underestimated the Turks, largely due to imperial ethnic prejudices. Kenan Çelik is one of the most knowledgeable Turkish historians. The statue of Mustafa Kemal, founder of modern Turkey, dominates this strategic height, Chunk Bahia.
This is like a British arrogance, always underestimating Turks. We were defeated by our generals, and this, caused us to defeat. So rather than keep saying this, they should recognize and say and give some credit to Turkish man who fought here for the home country.
Well, I think a young Lieutenant Colonel George S. Patton in Staff College, the US Army, sums it up brilliantly. This was before he became the famous general in World War II, and he did a study of the Gallipoli campaign. And he stressed the importance of having the right officers in the right place at the right time for being on the offence and also defence. And he suggested that it was not the Ottoman army that defeated the British at Suvla Bay. It was von Sanders, it was Major Vilma and Mustafa Kemal. They defeated Stopford, Ian Hamilton and General Sitwell. So he suggested that if they swapped those commanders, Gallipoli would have been a great success for the British instead of the dismal failure it ended out to be.
Although the Ottoman Empire's frontiers in 1900 extended far into Europe and Africa, by the outbreak of war in 1914, it had lost Romania, Bulgaria, Bosnia and Libya, and was in debt with Britain, France, Germany and Russia, who controlled most of the trade. When war broke out, Turkey was neutral and in the throes of internal upheaval, with a new government intent on modernizing and westernizing a corrupt, inefficient state. The most powerful man in Turkey at the time was the megalomaniac war minister Enver Pasha.
Enver Pasha took the command of chief of staff, war minister, so under his control a few portfolios like ministries. So he carried out big change in Turkish army. About 1,300 officers, mostly old generation, and who were held responsible for Balkan disaster, Balkan defeat, they were sacked. Then all the academy graduates were appointed to replace old people. For example, Mustafa Kemal was one of them, and only 35 years old, and he commanded 12,000 men.
Another man with an extraordinary ego changed the course of Turkish history. When then British Navy Minister Winston Churchill ordered that 2 battleships built in Britain but paid for by the Ottoman government be requisitioned by the British Navy, the Germans eagerly donated 2 of their own. They offered the Goeben and Breslau to the Ottoman Empire. But when the new warships were used to attack Russian ports in the Black Sea, this prompted the Allies to declare war on Turkey. Churchill saw an opportunity to gain control of the most vital seaway in Europe, the Dardanelles, and persuaded the government and the War Minister, Lord Horatio Kitchener, to agree to a naval attack that he believed would be decisive in winning the war. On the 19th of February 1915, British and French ships sailed up the Dardanelles to destroy the forts at the entrance to the straits. But when the main attack on the straits began on the 18th of March at Çanakkale, 3 ships were sunk and 3 others were severely damaged by Turkish fire and undetected mines. The fortress at Mecidiye on the European side of the Dardanelles was the backdrop to a memorable episode of Turkish heroism. The Ottoman mobile artillery was wreaking havoc on French and British battleships, but they were running out of ammunition. On the other hand, the heavy guns at Çanakkale were a fixed target for the Allied ships. Here at Mecidiye Fortress, the gun crane had been destroyed. Rather than cease firing, legend has it that the Turkish soldier Said Ali Shabuk took it on himself to carry 3 275-kilogram shells to be loaded into the gun breech, one of which would reportedly sink a French battleship. Although it seems practically impossible for him to do this alone, Corporal Said became one of Turkey's greatest heroes, an icon of Turkish resistance. His feats are just the first of a series of Gallipoli campaign legends that live on today. With the navies in retreat, preparations began for large-scale troop landings on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Unable to penetrate the Dardanelles Straits with ships alone, military strategists plotted to capture Constantinople by land. The plan was simple enough. 50,000 troops from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, India and France would land and quickly capture the high ground behind the forts commanding the straits and allow the fleet to penetrate the Dardanelles. Britain's best general, Ian Hamilton, was given command. Steve Chambers is a historian and author specialised in the Gallipoli campaign.
So Ian Hamilton, as a case in example, was probably one of the best general officers, if not in Britain, in the world at that time. And this is something the Germans actually say of him. He had probably fought in every single campaign from the late 1870s. He had written books on musketry and modern warfare, and this was quite rare in the British Army at that time. They had understood that the war was changing.
Commanding on the other side of the battle was one of Germany's best generals, Otto Liman von Sanders, the cool-headed and decisive Prussian advisor to the Ottoman government. Heading up the 19th Division was 34-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal.
British staff, mostly old people, old generation, but Turks, old graduates of academies, they got these ranks through aptitude tests and very hard exams. When you look at their, diplomas and marks, in the classes, they're like mathematicians, points between 95 and 100. So best brains we applied in Turkish army.
However hastily drawn up, The plan still gave the defenders 4 weeks to prepare. Ian Hamilton was also given inferior tools to do the job. The only unit of professional troops was the 29th Division.
The best unit the British had here at Gallipoli was the 29th Division. They were a regular division. However, they've never really trained together. They had been put together from different parts of the empire. Some were serving in India, some were serving in the UK. And together they never trained above brigade level. And this brought challenges for the officers commanding them. And a lot of these were fast promoted from colonel to brigadier general to commander brigade, or even major general to commander division. So even though they had a lot of experience commanding smaller units or maybe as big as a brigade, commanding the division was something completely different.
The British territorial units and the brand new Australian and New Zealand Army Corps that came in to support the offensive were undertrained. The government wanted to win the campaign on the cheap, and the commander received second-rate officers and soldiers.
The equipment of the territorials was lesser than that of the regulars. It was inferior quality, still effective but not as good as the regular equipment. Also the rifles were slightly inferior as well, where the regulars had the modern SMLE, the short magazine Lee Enfield, very, very good rifle that they could fire 15 rounds per minute through. The territorials had old antiquated rifles from the Boer War, the old long Lee Enfield. Still a very, very good weapon, but not as good as the SMLE.
The defending Ottoman army was well trained. The Turkish soldiers fighting in Gallipoli were well equipped with Mauser M1903 bolt-action rifles, although many carried the 1883 version.
We got German rifles, Mauser, not quick when you compare to Lee Enfield, British rifle, but snipers would prefer German Mauser. I talked to Turkish veterans who said to me, we had snipers, Turkish snipers. We used to put a coin between our fingers like this, then hold it like this. There were Turkish snipers who shoot and get the coin without hurting the fingers. We say 3 things in a man's life are so important: horse, woman, and rifle.
The 25th and 57th Turkish regiments were among the best the empire could field. These hardened Turkish soldiers had already fought in many wars during the Balkan crises of the past decade. They were not just conscripts drawn from the vast plains of Anatolia. These were men who were fighting to save the jewel in the Ottoman crown, Constantinople itself.
Turks put best troops on the peninsula before British landed here. So experienced and trained, and organization was okay. And then Istanbul did their best to help Turks here. In terms of food supply, it was okay, like heart of the country. If Turks lost Gallipoli, then they could lose Istanbul, capital. And then today, most probably there would be no Turkish existence in Europe.
Bad weather and the need to train the Australian and New Zealand volunteers in Egypt were a boon for Liman van Sanders, who had 4 whole weeks to prepare land defences. At 4 a.m. on the 25th of April 1915, the troop landings began. The Australian and New Zealand Corps, or Anzac, were tugged ashore by small steamers and had to row the last few metres. They had been spotted by Turkish commanders, who underestimated the size of the invading force.
So Turkish headquarters, 9th Division headquarters, didn't expect any landing from this spot. And then moon set, and then Turks lost sight of the ships. So under the cover of darkness, without any naval bombardment, they came, and when they were, say, 100 yards, 200 yards to the beach, then Turks saw them. Right on the beach where they landed, nearly 500 yards they covered in initial landing. 3rd Brigade from Australia landed, 3 battalions, 1,500 strong, from 3 warships. And then 86 guys had to deal with these people.
They stood their ground. They could hear the bushes moving below us. They could hear the scramble of troops coming up the cliff face. They laid down fire. Very, very quickly, the Anzacs, the Australians predominantly for the first part of the landings, got to the top of the cliff in little less than 15 minutes, 20 minutes at the outside, overwhelmed the Ottoman defenders here at the top and pushed them back. Over on the other side, the Australians pushed right over towards 400 Plateau and down the other side towards the Third Ridge.
The first waves of Anzacs pushed up the steep hills, sweeping the light Ottoman defences off the ridges and reaching an arc of hills they gave distinctive names to: Baby 700, Russell's Top, the Neck. However, they found that the only way up to the higher ground was along narrow ridges, where the defenders had the advantage. By 7 in the morning, the company of Turkish defenders had finished their ammunition. Mustafa Kemal was at the head of the 57th Regiment, rushing up to support.
He saw Australian infantry advancing and then Turks retreating, so just intercepted them. And then he said, "Why are you retreating?" They pointed to the hill where Anzacs, coming. "And enemy," they said. "But you have bayonets, take out, fix and lie down." And then Turks stopped. Seeing this, Australian infantry also stopped. This not only saved the day, but the entire campaign and then future of the country.
More waves of troops disembarked, but Ottoman guns began firing at the beach. The legendary Ottoman 57th Regiment swung into action, while the 27th blocked the Australian advance to the south.
In his order, he said, because it was so significant, "I don't order to attack or to die. In the time which passes until we die, others can come here and reinforce us." Resistance was so important at that stage, crucial.
The ultimate objective of this landing was, one, to hold the Third Ridge. The Third Ridge goes from Gaba Tepe right away up to the Bair Ridge and push from the hills close to where we're standing at the moment over the plain of Maidos to capture the narrowest part of the peninsula. When Mustafa Kemal and the 57th Regiment came over the ridge around Bair, they were able to stop the Australian advance and then bayonet attack and push them back.
By the end of the day, they were pinned down in this tiny stretch of shoreline. The commanding officer, General William Birdwood, proposed evacuation. At Cape Helis, the British attacked this beach, known to them as V Beach, at 6:30 in the morning. They had planned to land 3 regiments, 2 aboard the coal ship River Clyde that was to have been rammed ashore, allowing the 2,000 troops inside to disembark, while another regiment was to be brought ashore in rowing boats.
The landing here at V Beach was going to be what we call a noisy landing. They were not coming in at night like at Anzac. Here was a full daylight landing, and the reason for that was the Royal Navy needed to see their targets. So what Hunter Weston, who was commanding the operation here, relied upon was the full weight of the naval bombardment to destroy and neutralise the Turkish defences.
The ridge overlooking the beach was fortified, with trenches and barbed wire, although little more than a company of men defended it. The naval bombardment was ineffective due to the flat trajectory of the shells that landed either too far behind or in front of the defences.
We landed, first of all, the first wave in rowing boats. These comprised of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. Turkish rifle fire fell down onto the victims in those boats. Those who did manage to climb out in full pack, full equipment, weighing up to 70–75 pounds, fell into the water. Some drowned, others stumbled ashore with or without rifle. Those with rifles who could get to the sandbank then found their rifles to be inoperable. Luckily, there's a sandbank, a small cliff, or shelf rather, about 5 feet up from the beach, and that enabled them to shelter from the rifle fire from the Turks in the trenches behind me.
The River Clyde collier was supposed to have been akin to a Trojan horse, ramming the beach and allowing 2,000 men it carried to land directly onto dry land. It got stuck on the rocks, and Turkish soldiers could pick the men off as they left the sally ports.
The first 50 men out of the River Clyde, led by one officer, 48 of them were killed or wounded, only 2 got to the beach. So you had this cluster of bodies fallen from the River Clyde onto the rock spit you see behind me. One of the heroes of the day was a Commander Unwin, who was the commander also of the River Clyde. He dived into the ocean, all under fire, connected up these boats by just manpower, taking the ropes from each boat, pulling them together with the manpower, tying them together to allow this bridge to connect the shore. He did this several times under fierce enemy fire.
At 9 a.m, the landing was stopped. But just 2 kilometers north, another slaughter was unfolding. On this beautiful sandy beach, known as W, where still today the remains of British hardware rust under the Gallipoli sun, the Lancashire Fusiliers, soldiers from rural northern England, were killed before they even made it ashore.
There was barbed wire on the beach, and then again traps in the water, like landmines, and then just on top Turkish trenches.
Of the 200 men in the first wave, only 21 survived, the heaviest death toll of all the landings. But the defenders were outflanked by a landing further north and eventually forced to retreat.
They were told to wait till 400 yards range and open fire. It was very costly, more costly than we beached round the corner.
At dawn, they were able to charge up from the beaches, where 2 more Victoria Crosses were won from Captain Wolford, Royal Artillery, and Lieutenant Colonel Charles Doughty Wiley, VC, Royal Welsh Fusiliers. They took their men forward. Actually, they didn't take their men forward. They weren't supposed to be there. These were staff officers. The staff officers took these men forward because of the huge amount of officer casualties in the infantry battalions, stormed these trenches. At the time the Turks were pulling back, they realised that the game was probably over now at that stage, because they're being enfiladed from the W Beach landing.
Overlooking V Beach are the remains of 2 fortresses, the ancient Ottoman fort Sed al-Bahir, and on the other side, the powerful guns of its 20th century counterpart. Behind it, the Turkish cemetery, and below that, the British graveyard. Close to this tragic site lies the only lone grave of the whole campaign, Charles Doughty Wiley.
We're here at the grave of Colonel Charles Doughty Wiley, VC. He was in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers and attached to the General Staff. He led the charge with his walking cane in hand. He vowed never to take arms against the Turks because he was a friend of the Turks prior to the war. At the moment of glory, he got to the top of this hill, captured the fort, and then unfortunately got shot by a Turkish sharpshooter.
Charles Doughty Wiley's wife was a nurse on a nearby island, but he also had a romantic liaison with one of the most famous women of the Middle East, explorer and spy Gertrude Bell.
There was one woman visitor to this grave during the campaign. It's important to understand there were no women fighting on Gallipoli, there were no women nurses on Gallipoli. So who was this lone woman who came to visit this grave, allegedly in around November 1915?
French and other smaller forces had landed at Morto Bay, or S Beach as it was known, and at X and Y beaches, almost unopposed. Now the Allies were able to consolidate their positions on the tip of the Gallipoli Peninsula. But the shock of the losses on the landings had taken its toll. The sun sets on the Cape Helis monument to the British dead. In just 2 days, 3 battalions had been decimated, and the heights of Achi Baba were still out of reach. Three days after the landings, on the 28th of April, the French and British forces at Cape Helis made their first concerted effort to move forward to capture Achi Baba and then to attack the fortress at Kilit Bahir. This Turkish village now stands where the Greek village of Krithia once stood, razed to the ground by British guns. Here, the local British commander, Aylmer Hunter Weston, planned a daylight attack covered by artillery on land and sea. It was a disaster, and over the next weeks, the same tactic was repeated twice more. British, French and Turkish soldiers were slaughtered as attack was followed by counter-attack. The French were slightly more successful on the eastern edge of the line on the 21st of June, supported by heavy artillery in a rolling barrage. On the 28th of June, the British gained a kilometre of terrain during the Battle of Gully Ravine. But from then on, the Helis front was a stalemate. The forts at Kilit Bahir were unreachable. The little farming village of Beshyol was completely destroyed during the campaign. The villagers were recruited into the Ottoman army. Their families moved to the land behind the lines. Hassan is the grandson of a soldier sent twice to the front here in Gallipoli. That young soldier was stable boy to Enver Pasha when the war minister came to see the massacre for himself. Enver stopped the frontal attacks which were killing too many Ottoman soldiers.
Well, my grandfather was too young to join the army. He was taken by Enver Pasha as a stable boy and dispatch rider. He helped Enver Pasha by showing him the roads and the water wells. And then, when his elder brother was shot in the war, the younger one was released to go back home for a while and then recalled back for duty.
So total loss we suffered in 6 battles here, known as 6 battles of Krithia. 3 battles of Krithia and then 1 battle with English in Gully Ravine and then 2 with French on the left. Roughly 150,000 Turkish losses suffered and more than 100,000 British losses suffered. French lost nearly 30,000 men, nearly half dead. They were buried in a single cemetery in Gallipoli today. So total loss, nearly Allies lost 200,000 men here. And both sides, nearly 500,000 people, in Gallipoli campaign, total loss.
Hunter Weston was probably, as some people say, was one of these donkey generals. I don't know if that's strictly true, that he was a bit of a butcher and threw men into action aimlessly in these frontal attacks with bayonets only, facing the Turkish guns. But Hunter Weston was not stupid. That was really the only options available to him at that time.
Here, Turkish army suffered more casualties than Allies. And the main reason was flat country, not much cover. And before every battle, and then Navy bombarded Turkish lines, so devastated Turkish trenches. Mostly they tried to advance along the flanks, getting in support from the Navy rather than in the middle. But Turks knew this very well, so they attacked in the middle. So when the lines advanced on the flank, but Turks made a bridge in the middle, then British had to move back to make, in line with that area. So then had to retreat to the back.
The Allied troops were ill-equipped to face the battles that were to follow. Logistics were a nightmare. A shortage of shells forced the British artillery to limit themselves to firing just 1 shell a day in order to save ammunition for big offensives.
British artillery here was very ineffective. 1, we didn't have enough guns, and 2, we didn't have enough shell. The shell we did have was really, on the majority, was shrapnel shell. Shrapnel shell is okay to use with troops in the open, where it would spray the canister of shell, the ball bearings inside, and splatter the fields in front of us. However, to destroy wire, to destroy trenches, to destroy machine gun emplacements, which were fortified with sandbags and dug in well, you needed high explosives.
Life for the Allied infantrymen was miserable. There was nowhere for troops off duty to really rest, and too few men to keep the British military machine working properly. Food and sanitation were poor. Disease was rampant.
The British had only advanced maximum of 4 miles here at Gallipoli, at the Helis side of the peninsula, so they could go back to the beaches, but still under Turkish shell fire. They would also be used for labour. They would be building piers, building and digging trenches. It was very, very hard work in a climate that is very hot. They would have been on poor rations, predominantly bully beef and biscuits. Bully beef during the summer would melt in the tins. It turned into liquid. It was horrible.
Hassan's memories of his grandfather bring to life the horror and humanity of the war here.
Personally, I was a little boy and my grandfather didn't speak much about the war, but he did say that the soldiers did not have a bad relationship with each other. They threw tobacco and water to each other. They looked after each other when they were wounded, but when their commanders ordered them to shoot, they had to obey orders.
The geography of the Gallipoli Peninsula played a decisive part in the stalemate that followed the Allied landings. The terrain was rugged. Roads were bad. At Anzac, the mountain ranges that slope towards the sea have steep escarpments, and the ridges are diagonal to the shoreline. So they had to be stormed one by the Australian and New Zealand troops before they could take advantage of the gullies that eventually afforded them protection from enemy snipers. Here, in Shrapnel Gully, the phenomenon is abundantly clear. The Australians eventually occupied a line below the ridge beyond the gully. But only a few yards away, the Ottomans had built impregnable trenches. The only way out of the enclave was upwards, northeasterly, towards Chunk Bahia. Machine gun fire mowed down troops engaged in mass attacks, while sniper fire killed individual soldiers at random on a daily basis.
We're standing here in the Australian front line. This is on 400 Plateau. Over to the right hand side is Johnston's Jolly, and behind me is the memorial above Lone Pine. And this was 400 Plateau, one of the objectives of the landing, which was overrun very, very quickly. Of course, first days of the landings, there were no trenches here. These were dug later. When this impasse happened, trench warfare, we all dug in. It became this holding pen for the Anzac division. 24,000 men, 2 divisions were penned in here. Behind me, the road you can just see represents the front line. Between here and up towards Quinn's Post, the road represents the front line, how narrow it was between the Australian and New Zealand trenches and those of the Ottomans on the other side of the road.
Both sides were constantly being reinforced, and now, with a massive army of 42,000 men, Mustafa Kemal believed he could push the Australians out of Anzac Cove altogether. The attack was launched less than a month after the landings. A quarter of his men died, and still the Australian and New Zealand troops resisted the attack. It was Anzac's most heroic day. The day Australian stretcher bearer John Simpson Kirkpatrick and his mule were killed and entered the Australian Book of Heroes.
There's lots of myth about John Simpson. The myth really comes along about how many people he saved, and we get quotes from 2 to 3 to even 400 men he's bringing down from the lines. Seeing he only operated here between the 25th of April and the 19th of May, how many men would that be per day? Roughly works out to be 12, 14 casualties per day.
The Turks and Australians arranged a truce to bury the dead. In these photos, the blindfolded Turkish officer is taken to Anzac headquarters to negotiate a truce. For the first time, they see each other for what they are: desperate men forced into a pointless battle. Audrey Herbert, an intelligence officer and later a politician who spoke Turkish, was present that day.
Aubrey Herbert says in his memoirs, there was a Turkish captain beside me while walking along no man's land, row after row, bodies lying. He said, "Look at this is diplomacy. Look at this is politics. We are poor soldiers here. May Allah protect all of us here."
The men who fought here on the Anzac front in Gallipoli were neither all Australians nor all young farmers, despite Australian mass media myths that sometimes suggest otherwise.
If you look at the occupations, a vast majority worked in the city. There were bankers, clerks, there were shopkeepers, cobblers, etc. So very few actually were from the farms, the outbacks. Saying that, you know, they were fairly fit, a lot of them. They were also fairly young, but not as young as a lot of accounts do make out. You do hear about these boy soldiers. There were no boy soldiers here during the landings. The average age of the Australian foot soldier was 28 years old in 1915.
In terms of health, Turks were better physically, stronger than British troops here in Gallipoli. And Berthoud later on, when he was questioned by Dardanelles Commission, he accepted this truth. He said Turks were stronger than British here in Gallipoli.
The Australian and New Zealand soldiers in the Anzac enclave were led by Australian General Birdwood, who answered directly to Ian Hamilton. The staff officers lived and worked close to enemy lines. General Bridges was shot in the leg by a Turkish sniper and died of gangrene. Too many men were penned into this tiny place.
One of the other myths is British officers led these Australians to their death. You know, they were sacrificed on this British Empire's altar. Totally not true. The Anzac Corps, with the New Zealanders as well, were commanded by Australian generals. In charge of the Corps was General Birdwood. He was actually born in India, but again became the Australian Corps commander and held in high respect by the Australians and New Zealanders. Bridges, another Australian there, commanded the 1st Australian Division.
By the end of June 1915, there was stalemate on both fronts. With stalemate at Cape Helis and at Anzac Cove, Ian Hamilton asked London for more troops to break the deadlock. He planned to allow the Australians and New Zealanders to break out of the Anzac enclave by making massive diversionary attacks at Helis, the southern Anzac, and on a new front to the north, at Suvla Bay. Once again, he was handed a wild card in the shape of the elderly General Frederick Stopford, a bumbling and inexperienced British officer. The landings were planned to coincide with attacks by the New Zealand Brigade towards the lightly defended Chunk Bair, while the Australians attacked at the neck. As diversions, the British attacked Krithia once more, the Australians attacked Lone Pine Ridge.
On the 6th of August, in the afternoon at 5 o'clock, the Australians went over the top from positions on this reverse slope, and they pushed the Turks back. They overran 3 or 4 trenches and dug in on the far side, overlooking the Turkish lines of communication and reserves. The Lone Pine fighting was very ferocious, very hand-to-hand, bitter fighting with bayonets, trench clubs and bombs, and they fought on for 3 days and 4 nights.
General Stopford's 10th and 11th Divisions landed at Suvla Bay under the cover of darkness, but chaos reigned supreme. By daylight on the 7th of August, rather than push forward, the British troops had lost contact with their general.
Communication is only as good as the people who are receiving the message or sending the message. And this is where so many elements of the Gallipoli campaign fell down. One example of that was Hamilton was adamant that communication was set up very, very early for the Suvla landings. So what he did was run cables for the island of Imbros from headquarters to Suvla here. Unfortunately, Stopford decided to move his headquarters during the day of the landing. So even though they managed to get cable across, there was no Stopford to talk to. He had disappeared.
The British soldiers had landed on the most advanced landing craft available at the time, the so-called Beetles.
Stand on the remains of a lighter. The lighters were used during the landings at Suvla during the night of the 6th of August 1915, and also for the final evacuation as well. In front of it there were 2 antennae almost, but this is where they got the nickname Beetle, these big black antennae, and attached to that would be a wooden ramp, still in force and held to the top of the antennae by chains.
The Australians attacked Lone Pine in a brutal battle that raged for 4 days in bloody hand-to-hand fighting. They gained a fine view over the Ottoman lines of supply. The main thrust, however, was to be between Chunk Bair and the neck. For the Allies, here again precious time was lost.
Junk Bair was so important to the Allies because it afforded two things. One, by capturing this summit, you deny the view from the Turkish side of the British positions and Anzac positions behind. As you see behind me, you've got the jewel there. You've got what the objective was, the Dardanelles Straits.
The plan was to rush the lightly defended defences at 4:30 a.m. to take the Ottomans by surprise.
The capture of Junk Bair was not without problems. They were to get up here on the 7th of August at 04:30 in the morning by dawn. That never happened. Colonel Johnston, who was the brigade commander, stopped his men short and had tea, which was absolutely unforgivable because he was only 500 metres from the summit. On the summit where we're standing today, there were no Turkish defenders. By the time Johnston pushed his troops forward, it was too late.
The Ottomans had occupied the summit before the New Zealanders could get there. And now there was no option but for a costly frontal attack.
He then ordered the Wellingtons under a Colonel William Malone to take the top. He refused. He refused the order of his commanding officer. And he said he will not do it in daylight. He will do it at dawn where he's afforded cover, he can plan the attack properly and use the bombardment prior to the attack to capture the top of the hill. That's exactly what happened. During the morning of the 8th of August, Wellington Battalion, commanded by William Malone, stormed up to the top of this hill, took the trenches and started digging in.
The breakout was planned for the 7th of August, and Chunk Bahir was the highest point of the Ottoman defences. If it could be captured while the Turks were busy elsewhere, there was a chance of cutting the peninsula in half. The New Zealanders held the heights for as long as they could, but they arrived too late to support another attempt at breakout by the Australians at the neck.
He held on for 2 days. He was supported by other New Zealand battalions. The New Zealand Mounted Rifles came up, 2 British battalions as well, but they could just hold the reverse slope but not the summit. So even though they had a brief glimpse of the Dardanelles very early that morning on the 8th of August, that was lost to them later on that day, never to be seen again.
While the senior officers lost the initiative here on Chunk Bahir, the soldiers fought heroically.
The fighting up at Junk Bair was probably the most fierce of all Gallipoli battles. The New Zealand regiments that were involved in here, the Wellington Battalion for example, the Mounted Rifles, suffered hugely. And if you can imagine the ground around us here just being full of dead and dying soldiers of both sides. The Wellington Battalion for example came up to the top of the hill with 700 men. It came down from the hill with 35, which gives you an illustration of how heavy the casualties were. That battalion ceased to exist. They lost their commanding officer, they lost all their company commanders, they lost the vast majority of their officers, hardly anyone came down at all.
Meanwhile, the troops at Suvla Bay had made no move towards the semicircle of hills overlooking the coast, although they knew that within 48 hours Ottoman reserves would be arriving. Mustafa Kemal replaced the sick local commander.
On the 8th of August in the afternoon, finally Turkish columns started reaching from long march from the neck of the peninsula, nearly 60 kilometers. Turkish, 16 Army Corps, 12th Division and 7th Division. Mustafa Kemal, in his memoirs, he said, "I'm very grateful to British General Stafford because he waited for me 2 days till I get ready."
Suvla was not aimed to do anything more than secure the base. Once that was secure, they would then use the forces ashore, part of General Stopford's 9th Corps, to support the Anzac operation to break out of Anzac, where we stand in here on the ridge, push over the Sarri Bair Ridge, and then try and cut the peninsula in half. It's really the same plan as the 25th of April. It hadn't changed that much. It was just more men were available to do it this time, which was something Hamilton wanted. Now he has the men, now allegedly he has the resource. Could he do it?
The 48-hour delay condemned the Suvla landings to failure. When the British did move forward and occupied some of the Anafata hills, they found the Turks were waiting for them. Tantalizingly close was Chunk Bahir, the high point where the New Zealanders were fighting to the death. Suvla Bay had become another useless enclave of British troops in the Gallipoli campaign. Ian Hamilton decided that it should at least be linked with Anzac Bay, and the Turks pushed back from their dominating position. Between the 21st and 27th of August 1915, one of the most complex battles of the campaign raged around Hill 60, where the Australian light horse managed to capture the frontline Turkish trenches and take prisoners, with the help of Indian and New Zealand troops on the flanks. They ran out of resources before they could exploit their slight advantage, and the Ottoman forces reoccupied much of the ground they had lost. The British troops at Suvla supported the action by advancing on the Anafata Hills, in particular Scimitar Hill.
Where hills, for example Scimitar Hill, had been in British hands earlier on that day, they had evacuated it in some confusion. When they come back to capture Scimitar Hill, it was in Ottoman hands. There's also a lot of heavy brush, and that became so tinder dry that any sort of spark set it off. Very sadly, what happened to Scimitar Hill and the surrounding area, it all caught fire. Not on the Turkish side, on the British side. And the troops that were trying to fight their way through it were consumed very, very quickly by the fire.
It was the last battle of the campaign. In September, Bulgaria entered the war, giving Turkey direct access to supplies of guns and shells from Germany, and General Hamilton was replaced by General Charles Munro. There were to be no more attacks in Gallipoli. The Allies and Ottomans made life as unpleasant for each other as possible by sniping, even using periscopes to allow them to keep their own heads down. The campaign had been a dismal failure, but the British and Anzac troops still had to survive and defend their positions. They built tunnels and dugouts to watch and listen for Turkish attacks. Steve Chambers has found one of them just below the machine gun post known as the Apex.
We know a lot about the war on top in the trenches, but at Gallipoli we don't know much about the war underground. This is a New Zealand tunnel built towards the end of the campaign by the New Zealand engineers and infantry. Where it goes is from the rhododendron ridge, from their front line, right under the Turkish positions. It had two purposes. One, as an observation post for the Turkish trenches, over on Battleship Hill on the other side of this spur, and also to listen to the Turks in their frontline trench. The Turks would have been probably 150 to 200 metres along this track under a defensive position called the Apex.
The tunnel proceeds for 100 metres and then branches off to the left and downwards.